Now, joining me in the studio is Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. Dan, Hamas reportedly agreeing to the request of Israel to ask for these 11 males to be added to the list of hostages who will be released in the first phase. And in return, they're asking for more compensation. What could that look like? What can we expect them to be asking for?
I think they're asking for prisoners, basically, and high-quality prisoners from their perspective. And also the timing of the phases, the length of the phases, Philadelphia corridor, and things of that nature. The main discourse in Israel is whether Israel could have possibly done more to go for an everyone for everything deal where all the hostages are returned, because, as you heard in the report, there is a strong concern, a very valid concern, that the first phase may be the only phase. Because Hamas will retain some prisoners in its hands, or in Islamic Jihad hands, with which to bargain for an end to the war. And Netanyahu has made very clear, including over the weekend in a Wall Street Journal interview, note that he is only interviewed in Wall Street Journal and foreign media and not really in Israeli media. He made clear that that he will not agree to an end to the war until Hamas is out of power, which makes a lot of sense, because most Israelis want all the hostages back, but they also don't want to leave Hamas in power. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. But where the plot thickens is that many people in Israel believe that Israel itself has engineered a situation where if it leaves Gaza, Hamas remains in power, because Netanyahu has an interest in a forever war for political reasons. Yes.
Right, well, we'll get back to that, but I want to bring into the conversation now Gidi Grinstein, a former peace negotiator under Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and founder of the Reut Group. Now, we're hearing more and more details of the deal, but a lot is still unconfirmed, of course. And what does seem clear, though, is that we're looking at a deal in phases. And as someone with experience in the field of negotiating, what does that tell you about the chances for, one, Israel getting back all the hostages, and two, the ceasefire actually holding throughout the three phases?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I believe that obviously right now we're converging into a partial deal, meaning some of the hostages will be released. They're talking about in the range of 30 to 40 hostages in exchange for a few hundred of Palestinian prisoners, including what we call some heavyweights, meaning people that were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is actually signaling to the Arab side, to the Qataris, to the Egyptians, to the Hamas, that he has no intention of ending the war. And therefore, the Hamas has no intention of actually doing a comprehensive deal. And as Dan Perry said earlier, the plot thickens not only in the sense that that Israel has not made it clear what it wants in Gaza, but Israel has not introduced a single alternative to the Hamas government in Gaza. Meaning Israel, the only possible alternative to the control of Hamas in Gaza is the Palestinian Authority. And Israel, Netanyahu, has actually blocked out the Palestinian Authority and has not taken the steps to prepare the Palestinian Authority for taking over and governing Gaza, which then would also allow the introduction of an international force that begin to deal with the Gaza reconstruction and take on the challenge of security.
Right.
Meaning Israel itself is not preparing the conditions for the removal of Hamas. And that is a very complicated conundrum right now.
Yes.
All right, but before we get to that step even, there are a few steps before that I want to discuss with you. A Palestinian senior official told the BBC that the deal is 90% complete, except for a few issues, and that includes the Israeli military presence currently in the Philadelphia corridor, which of course runs along the border with Egypt. How likely is this to be resolved, and what could that solution potentially look like?
I've said here on the show and other cases, on other shows, also on I-24 and other, it is clear what needs to happen in Gaza. It's been clear for months. Gaza needs to be redivided into Area A and B. The security perimeter around Gaza needs to be declared Area B, where Israel has temporary security control, Palestinian civilian control, but there are no Palestinians there, according to which really makes the situation much simpler compared to the West Bank. And the Philadelphia corridor, if and when it is declared Area B, the Palestinians know that it will be part of the Palestinian area deep into the future. The IDF has always said that the Philadelphia corridor should not be a problem. There have been arrangements with Egypt. We know that the Egyptians have been serious about blocking the border, and that the Rafah crossing can be operated by the Palestinian Authority. So the building blocks for an arrangement around the border between Gaza and Egypt are there. The challenge is bringing them together. But again, in the longer term, it is very clear. There needs to be a transition period in Gaza of 4, maybe 5 years, dividing Gaza into area A and B, reigniting economic life in Gaza by introducing the interim agreement that exists in the West Bank in Gaza, allowing the international force to come in and the Palestinian Authority with security forces. All of these things are essential. The question is, when will we get there?
Right, so you're looking ahead. Meanwhile, we have these ongoing talks right now, ongoing efforts, and we've heard that there is a, quote, unprecedented desire to reach a deal on both sides. This is the language used to describe the situation right now, and yet, of course, Israel is continuing its operations in Gaza. There are reports of at least 2 deadly strikes in the strip today. Are we looking at 2 sort of separate but parallel paths right now, that Israel is going for the military path and then the diplomatic sort of side by side, or are they completely intertwined at this moment?
At this phase, everything is integrated. Everything is intertwined. The military activities are part of the pressure and the signaling to Hamas that Israel has what we call in the world of negotiations an off-the-table option, meaning if you don't get an agreement with us, we can push you and squeeze in other areas. At the same time, what is happening is that there is this direct negotiations, probably called corridor negotiations, but is because the Israelis are in one room, Hamas is in the other room, the Qataris and the Egyptians are going back and forth in some hotel in Cairo or in some other place around the Middle East. But there's also signaling that is happening between the leaders, which is what happened last weekend, as Dan Perry described, through the Wall Street Journal. Netanyahu is communicating with the Arab side above the head of the negotiators, signaling to them his red lines. So there could be that there is technical rapprochement in the positions, meaning the number of prisoners that will be exchanged, the number of hostages will be released, all sorts of security arrangements, perhaps the movement of Palestinian population to some areas in the northern Gaza, although some of them are biblically destroyed in terms of the biblical in terms of the level of destruction there, and it's not livable. At the same time, there are the political signaling that has been going on, as I mentioned earlier, in which Netanyahu makes it very complicated for the Palestinian side to agree for a deal when he vows to continue the war. Certainly, it prevents the prospects of a comprehensive deal.
All right. Gidi Grinstein, thank you very much for your analysis and your input tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Still with me in the studio is Dan Perry. You mentioned this earlier. We just heard Gidi Grinstein mention it, the interview that Benjamin Netanyahu did with the Wall Street Journal, where he said that there is not going to be a deal if Israel has to end the war. Israel is going to continue the war. We know that Hamas has said that at least some sort of commitment from Israel of ending the war has to be present. And now Netanyahu's political rivals, his critics, are saying that he's trying to blow the deal, that he's not actually interested in the deal. What are your thoughts on the situation right now?
I wrestle with my own desire not to sound too cynical and not to ascribe to Netanyahu motivations and strategies that would be morally reprehensible. But the suspicion in much of Israel is that Netanyahu has a need to prolong the war in order to, A, keep his government afloat, because an end to the war on terms unacceptable to the right wing, the far right, and the right wing wants to occupy Gaza and resettle it, would bring down his government. And 2, an end to the war would end this paradigm, would end the applicability of the paradigm where Netanyahu says, well, yeah, October 7th was a horrible debacle and we need to investigate it, but only after the war. That obviously incentivizes a forever war. Now, do I really think the Prime Minister of Israel, because of that situation, is willing to prolong the war in a way that condemns hostages to death and will cause, therefore needlessly, the death of more soldiers and Palestinian Gazans? I mean, that would be wrong. But I tell you, at least half of Israel thinks that's what's going on, and that's a very unhealthy situation karmically. I don't want to believe it's so, but it's hard to otherwise explain why what's happening is happening.
Right.
It's not just that Israel has refused to create the foundations for a day after Hamas in Gaza, but also Israel's on the ground. Israel's military is not acting like the eradication of Hamas is imminent. They've settled in for what looks to be a long-term insurgency, not unlike what the Americans faced in Iraq. So when Netanyahu says, we won't end the war until Hamas is crushed, but does nothing to actually crush Hamas, it kind of looks like he's going for forever war. And Hamas will not release its final hostages until the war is over. So what should be done is precisely what Gidi said, and more. I mean, Israel should long ago, we're a year and 2 months into the war. Long ago, Israel should have said, this is the deal. Palestinian Authority needs to go back in, but not in its current constitution, but with reforms and with the assistance of the Arab world and with international backing. And we're going to do all this great stuff that will bring in a global backing for reconstruction of Gaza and create a positive narrative that will create tremendous pressure on the remnants of Hamas to essentially surrender. And probably it needed to put on the table a plan to allow what remains of Hamas to leave Gaza and go someplace that likes them, maybe Turkey, maybe Qatar. None of this was done, none of it. And I repeat, the tactics on the ground are cat and mouse games with an insurrection. So Israel, that knew how to take out Hezbollah when it wanted to, because it has no political complication there, and knew how to make a deal, and knows how to win Nobel Prizes and be a global leader.
So a lack of willingness is what you're saying.
It kind of looks like they're not trying to create the circumstances on the ground that would enable an end to the war, and that is dispiriting, it's shocking, and it is at the core of what is right now in Israel just horrible and toxic bad karma, where what remains of this government support, about a third of the people, are at real loggerheads with the 70% or so that notice something is off and want a paradigm shift.